So with that, I'm going to turn this over to our moderator, Dr. Jan Naaman, who is the founding director of the Urban Studies Institute at Georgia State University's Andrew Young School of Policy Studies.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be with you. There's many of us here, and we are on a fairly tight schedule, I think. We want to get as much interaction as possible. It is my pleasure first to introduce the panelists who are with us today, and after that I want to quickly set the stage for our discussion, level a few questions at the panelists, and then we'll turn to you. So that's what the program looks like. I will start with Dr. Eloisa Klementich, who is the CEO of Invest Atlanta. And the mission of Invest Atlanta is to advance Atlanta's global competitiveness by growing a strong economy, building vibrant communities, and increasing economic prosperity for all Atlantans. She has come to Atlanta from holding positions with the federal government, with California state government, with local governments in advisory capacities. And she is very active in Atlanta and beyond Atlanta in various foundations and other organizations. We also have Dr. Sam Cheribi, who hails from the wonderful country of the Netherlands and Morocco. I'm Dutch myself also. And we have the same alma mater, which is the University of Amsterdam. Yeah. He is with Emory University, a senior lecturer of Middle Eastern Studies, and he's also the director of Emory's Development Initiative, which promotes development in low-income countries. And he works with faculty in Emory's Institute of Human Rights, so brings a very broad perspective to our discussion today. He's a former member of the Dutch Parliament, where he served for 2 sessions as well. Rohit Malhotra.
Call me Dr. Malhotra if you'd like.
Yes.
Just so I can fit in on this panel.
I'm feeling okay though, but if I start to feel unwell,
okay,
I might call on you. He's the founder and executive director of the Center for Civic Innovation, a very innovative enterprise that he is leading. The mission of his center is to push Atlanta to be a smart, equitable, and engaged city by investing in community-driven ideas, supporting social enterprises, and engaging people in dialogue and action. And Rohit's background is in social entrepreneurship, digital communications, and community organizations, and he too is very active around Atlanta and a member of the directors of the Metro Atlanta Chamber of Commerce. So, wonderful panel. Thank you for being here. Let me just take a few minutes and try to keep that confined to a couple of minutes to set the stage for this discussion on gentrification and the gentrification dilemma. And it seems to be truly a dilemma. We live in what many of us call a new economy. And the new economy, that is to say a digital economy, a information-based economy, that is very much an urban economy. And if over past decades, cities have suffered some cities have declined, some cities have lost economic activity, that has been reversed in the last 15 or 20 years. And it has been reversed at a very fast pace. And there was a very interesting book that came out just a few years ago called The Great Inversion. And what it meant was that people came back to the cities, and particularly came back to central cities, to work, to live, to play, to do all these things. And it has revived cities. And some would say it has revived cities at a price. And that constitutes, in part at least, that dilemma of gentrification. This is happening everywhere. Right? I came to Georgia State from the University of Amsterdam. I've lived also and worked in Miami many years. And I do a lot of work in India, actually. And cities around the world experience this revival that has an underside, it seems, to it. And so just before I came to Atlanta, I remember a moment sitting in Amsterdam, sipping a coffee, and I looked at the menu, So you have all these different stages of gentrification, right? And on the menu in that coffee place, it offered a children's cappuccino. And I thought it was time to move on from Amsterdam and come to a place where it's all still very much moving in possibly different directions. Now, a few things about Atlanta, I think, that are important in this context. You know, and I just looked this up for the purpose of our meeting. We're in the South, the southern region of the United States, and if you look at other states, so if you put Atlanta in Georgia context, if you look at the biggest metro areas in other southern states, their relative importance in their state's economy isn't anywhere near Atlanta's weight in the Georgia economy. So on average, so if you take, say, Miami, greater Miami in Florida, if you take Jackson, Mississippi, if you take Birmingham, Alabama, if you take New Orleans in Louisiana, the share of these metro areas in their state's GDP is about a third. Greater Atlanta is 2/3 of the Georgia economy. It has slightly over half the population of the state of Georgia, and it has about 2/3 of the state's GDP, and both are growing. And if you look at what's happening in Georgia, this whole middle belt of Georgia from east to west is losing people. And this is where they are coming. And it is part of that movement. And from an economic point of view, this is, you know, enormously important. The weight of this economy and what it means across the state. But Atlanta is also, according to some recent research by the Brookings Institution, the most unequal city in the United States. And if you take the ratio of the top 5% of income earners and you compare that to what the bottom 20 income earners make, it's more than 18 times. Right? So if you're in the top 5, you make more than 18 times as much as people in the bottom 20. And there's no other city that's as unequal. Not San Francisco, not New York City, no, Atlanta is right there. And there's a dilemma too. And it's part, I think it's part of the context of this question of gentrification. So let me ask some questions of the panelists, and you can take a couple of minutes to answer those questions, and then perhaps later on we can ask you also to engage these questions, and of course, you know, we want to be open to other questions or ideas that people would have. So my first question to the panel would be, is gentrification good or bad or both? What's your take on that? To just get our thinking started on this topic.
Well, gentrification, the big G world, I think it's like, no matter how you define it, it has a negative and a positive, you know, connotation. It is like a hydra with many heads. Ones are good and some are bad. It is, you know, there is the great African-American sociologist, Julius Wilson, who wrote in this beautiful book about 4 neighborhoods in Chicago called There Goes the Neighborhood. The minute the gentrification kicks in, a lot of people, if you could say, the underclass, in a way, leaves actually, and the neighborhood becomes maybe less violent, more interesting, but at the same time, it's empty. It gets empty from its own, long-time residents, which is the biggest problem you see. And this is not only in Chicago or in the U.S., but as you said, it's a global phenomenon. Like the city, nobody talks about Africa, but let me talk something about Africa. The beautiful city of Marrakesh or Casablanca in Morocco. There are some beautiful houses in some poor neighborhoods. Now, tourists are moving into it, like Europeans are moving into it, buying it with a lot of money. And the problem is that the neighborhoods are becoming so empty from its dynamic. They are just becoming like empty touristic shells. And this is the big problem of gentrification sometimes. in developing countries versus advanced societies. In advanced societies, you could say it has a social cost. It breaks actually the social structures, the old social structures, and it replaces them with new ones that are really problematic for the underclass.
You know, when I think of gentrification, and I look at specifically the work that we have been doing here on the West Side. And in the West Side, in the 50s and the 60s, there were about 50,000 residents in the West Side. Now there's about 15,000 residents. And so there was, when we first started doing our work, there were about 80% of all parcels were either vacant or abandoned. So we knew that there was plenty of room to bring in or to allow or to even have welcome new community members. But what we started to focus on, to the point, and I think what we'll all say here in the panel was, is it gentrification that's bad, or is it displacement, the moment that someone feels that they have to leave and they can't afford to be there? And so what we've really been focused on is how do we ensure that there are programs specific, and I mean specific and thought out about how we retain those residents in the West Side with the culture, not lose the culture, the heritage, the vibrancy of what the West Side is, and yet still bring about a solid mixed community with balanced economic growth where the community can have restaurants and grocery stores and coffee shops by local owners. And so it's that balance that we're really trying to be very deliberate on in our programs and our efforts about legacy residents not feeling the need to be displaced. And we've broken it up into pieces because it's very complex between the homeowner pressures to a renter, to someone who's in between, to even our small businesses. And so really it's strategies within those that we have been looking at to try to make sure that we're very receptive and understanding what we can do to help ensure that people are not displaced and that legacy residents can stay in the West Side.
So for me, the word gentrification becomes a binary, right? So it's you either love it or you hate it. You're on one side or you're the other, which is what America does so well to make you on team blue or team red, and you pick which one you want to be on. Gentrification, I think, is completely, the word has eroded the conversation. Because what it means is, if you say I'm anti-gentrification, the assumption is, okay, well, you don't like nice things. You clearly just don't want things to get better. And if you're pro-gentrification, you're like, oh, so what you like doing is just taking people's stuff and making sure that they can't live where they want to live. It completely erodes the messiness of the real conversation. I grew up with the ultimate privilege in my life, which was growing up poor without knowing I was poor. And the biggest misconception that people have about people who are poor is that we don't like nice things. Like, we do. And that doesn't mean we want our neighborhoods to look like garbage. We don't want blight. We don't want things going on around us that we see other neighborhoods, if they call about their sidewalk, that sidewalk gets fixed in 2 minutes. But when I call in my neighborhood, then it's going to take 3 weeks just to get a phone call back because I'm not a priority in your political strategy. And so for me, gentrification, we really need to talk about what at the core are we worried about. The reason why people can't afford their homes is because we pay people like garbage. When you don't pay people well, and the economy as a whole rises, and you ultimately say, well, look, our housing is affordable relative to the rest of the country. You're not doing it relative to wage stagnation that has happened in cities where we don't pay people for the work that they do. You ultimately are telling people that someone's work is worth a lot more than yours, and when that someone decides to build a something in your backyard, then we're interested in your retention, we're interested in your growth. And no government agency or anything does this out of malice. It's never a bad intended thing. I come from the world of government. I worked in a presidential administration, and these are good people. But truth is that even in a conversation around gentrification alone, none of us are going through it, right? I think the empathy around what people go through on a day-to-day basis has become lost in the conversation. And I think that we need to take the word out because it's an academic exercise of who has the right stats and forgets about what people are actually going through on a day-to-day basis.
So it's a mixed bag, huh, is what we hear, and there are
They throw the word out.
and there are definitely problems and challenges there. So let's make this more concrete now. We've had some general expression of ideas here, and let's look at Atlanta. And tell me if you think that gentrification, if I can still use the word, has gone too far and too unchecked here in Atlanta. What are your answers?
Well, quickly, I could say yes, because if you look at, we got a beautiful beltline, we got a lot of beautiful buildings and new businesses, but the black communities are leaving those places, and this is the big problem. What to do to keep people of color and the vulnerable actually living in those places and profit from the new well-being arrangements that are being created by those businesses. That is the biggest challenge, I think.
Yeah, and I think we have gotten clear direction that our focus needs to be every program we have, and we're seeing things now, just less than 6 months ago, every program that the city has in offering incentives has to have affordability. That type of legislation did not exist before. So you see that there is a clear direction by both the Invest Atlanta board and by the city council to ensure that things are done differently now, that we are making sure that we are keeping our legacy residents and putting this in check for the city. And so I think there is a commitment here going forward under this administration to make sure that we are doing all we can to keep individuals in the city. And I can go through examples. We have several tools, in particular, whether you come to Invest Atlanta for, let's say, a tax allocation tool. If you have a multifamily project, you have to have at least 20% affordability in your project. If you have a retail component into it, you now have to have small biz or affordable for small business rental. That never existed before. So these are all new measures that are put in place through the direction of the council. So where we were in the past, yeah. Are we trying to change it moving forward? Yes. I think there's a commitment to us to move forward. Is there enough? Do we need to do more? Yes, of course. But I think that there's clear direction on how we want to move forward.
The most troubling part of the statistic of income inequality that the Brookings report brings out are the cities who actually have fallen off of that list because essentially they've suburbanized their poverty. So an amazing tactic that cities will often use is when people move out, they get to celebrate the fact that poverty has reduced because it's no longer in their city. And I think that Atlanta is at a point where that could be its reality. It wouldn't be the first time in its history that happened. It wouldn't be the first time that we have displaced people in this city. I think that the question Atlanta has to ask itself is, who are we building for? Are we building for people who are already here, or are we building for the people who want a second house in Atlanta, that they want to film their movies here? Because I think Eloise is right. This administration has sent a very clear signal that affordability is an important component. Mayor Bottoms has made a $1 billion commitment and has a thermometer in her office to figure out when we're going to hit it. But that doesn't discount the decade of time that we spent giving corporations discounts and benefits and time again being like, yeah, just build whatever you want. It's all good. Oh, displace, it's okay. Like that was, I mean, we're talking that wasn't ancient history. That was literally a city that is talking in social economics that believes in trickle-down work. And the trickle-down work, it's hurting people on the ground. And I think that I'm very optimistic about the direction of Atlanta, but power has to be given back to the neighborhoods. When Maynard Jackson was elected mayor, this was a black mayor elected by a dominantly white city. When Maynard Jackson was elected, they actually changed the city charter, not only to include a city council to establish the role of a city council president, but they also created something called neighborhood planning units, where actual neighborhoods were empowered to make decisions about what happens in their own backyard. that no one would do something to them. You would have to get permission to do something with them. And over the course of time, when we've wanted certain things to happen faster or certain corporations to get certain benefits, we've started to just kind of skirt those things. First, you skirt it. Then you defund it. Then you say, that's our legal check mark for how we say we've done community engagement. But truth is that if the one entity that a city has to make sure that people's voices are heard around the planning of the infrastructure in their neighborhood is completely defunded and is completely rendered not powerful, then I would ask the question to you, is a city really serious about gentrification?
Okay. So you started to answer part of question 3 in your remarks, and that is, but so let me first say, when I first asked you the question, you know, is it good, is it bad, is it a mixed bag, and you say it's messy, it's a mixed bag, and when I ask you about Atlanta, the negatives very much prevail in your answers, if I'm listening to you.
Because it's home.
Correctly. Well, but so it has gone too far, that was my question, and it has gone too unchecked. Now, there was also a remark, Eloisa, that in the past, yeah, that was wrong, and now we're trying to fix that. There's something about fast-moving, dynamic cities where perhaps you shouldn't be fixing things looking back. What you did wrong, you got to look ahead and plan ahead and see what you have to do to align with trends that you predict for the coming, say, 10 years or so. Now, so to continue on Atlanta, give us, say, 2, and I know it's a complex debate, but give us what in your mind are perhaps the 2 most important interventions here in Atlanta that should be made, that have to be made to change things for the better and to, you know, maybe to keep the good side of what you think gentrification brings or what it expresses, but what needs to be fixed? How can it be fixed here in Atlanta?
Yeah, so I'd say looking at this comprehensive, balanced economic growth, it really is a spectrum of things that we have to consider. It, you know, from affordable housing to health to technology to security to environment. I mean, education. It really is not, it's so hard to say, oh, do these 2 things and things will be better in Atlanta, because I think, and I really do try to take a moment to look back and see how did we handle things before and not make the same mistake, because I'm not going to live in the back and live in the history, but I do want to learn from history. And one of the things that when I first came in, when we went to the West Side, if you had asked someone before, how much did the city invest with the first stadium? The city invested about $40 million in the West Side. You'd walk in there and you'd be like, oh my God, where do they spend it? You didn't see it, and I'm sure you've walked that neighborhood. And I really drilled down, and the issue was that we provided affordable housing, and that was important. But that was the problem, was that's all they did was housing. And so what we did coming up this time was say, no, we cannot just focus on, it's not that it's not important, but if you only focus on housing, we got someone a home. They got into the home, but they weren't able to maintain the home. They had to then sell the home. They didn't have a job. They didn't have daycare. They didn't have a good school. So really it's been this comprehensive, so I'm sorry, I'm not going to stick to your rule of 2, but I really do think that it's the spectrum and working with partners and realizing that it's these public-private partnerships that have made it possible. Our money can only go for certain things, and I can think of like the West Side Works program, where we came in, built the building and the structure. The Blank Foundation came in and did all the programming that still exists today, that has taken over 200 individuals who were either minimum wage or underemployed and are now making, $18, $19 an hour and have a good solid job. So again, an example, but education, health, daycare, these are all important components. I'm sure of this one, technology, health, but sorry, I'm going to miss the rule, but I'd say more than 2, but it is across the spectrum and seeing a holistic view, and it's all about public-private partnerships because we cannot do it alone. And, and workforce training, sorry, I just can't miss that one's huge. Sorry.
No, I do agree with you with the PPP, public partnership. However, I would say every new company that moves into a neighborhood should sign a social contract to help the neighborhood revitalize, because if they don't do it, it's a big problem, because they need a commitment to be there to help also the people, not to have people leaving the place, or at least a percentage of people can leave, but not a big percentage. Second, which is really very, very important to do, just like what they did in Europe, some countries like Scandinavia or the Netherlands, which is actually some rent control, or make the people who are renting own the houses where they live. There's a very, very important incentive to make them stay in their houses. These are two important measures, I think.
Thank you.
I think the two things that I would push for, number one, minimum wage is very important. Not just as a federal requirement, state requirement. The city in the past has touted, look, we're going to pay a minimum of our employees X number of dollars, but I'd love to see the city of Atlanta make a commitment that they will not work with companies that do not pay under $15 an hour to their employees. Obviously, these things are not easy to do. It's very difficult. So I come from a family of small business owners. Paying these wages are tough, but there are companies that get away with not paying these wages when they actually have the ability to, because their dividends are more important. There's a difference between conflating what small businesses need versus what large corporations are being incentivized to have. The number of developers I watch that say, I can't believe we just got that couple of $1 million to be able to do the thing. Now we can put in the fancy elevator. Rather than they're not thinking about the wages of the people who are on it. We have to talk about wage. I would say the second most important thing is we need to completely revamp, and even if that means rewriting the city charter, we have to revamp the neighborhood planning units in the city of Atlanta. If we are not serious about giving power to the neighborhoods, then we need to just tell people, look, everything is going to be top down, and we're not serious about your voice, and if you don't like it, you can leave. Let's just say what we mean. If we don't mean that, which is, I believe in our heart of hearts, and I know Eloisa, and I've known Eloisa, and I know she could say certain things, and like, I can speak to where, I know where her heart is too. All of our hearts are in making sure that people are actually heard, that neighborhoods are developed with people at the center of them, and that it is beneficial for their future and their kids' future. But that will not happen if we don't have good vehicles for entities like Invest Atlanta to rely on to say, here is a great representative voice of the neighborhood, not just someone who's been tokenized as the one voice around gentrification.
Okay, so let me go to the fourth question.
Can I just real quick?
Real quick.
Does the state minimum wage, Rahit, what's the state minimum wage?
$5.15.
You know who's the lowest at the state is Alabama, and then Georgia. Just thought I'd throw that out.
Good point. So part of the problem maybe with gentrification is that you can ask the question, is this the fundamental issue? Does it cause the problems, or does it expose deeper problems that are going on? And there are some hints in what you're saying that actually would suggest the latter. Cities are very complex, dynamic systems, and policies that are being formulated target particular things in that city. And so it's also an academic exercise to say, yeah, it's all connected. And it's about this, and it's about that, and gentrification is one part of the big puzzle. But you have to formulate policies to try to fix some of these issues. And so there's a risk, perhaps also, in shifting attention away from gentrification and going to these other issues. But I'd like you to say just a few words about this. Do you think that gentrification is a major cause of the issues, or does it mostly serve to expose some of the deeper fundamental issues? Sam?
Well, I think it's just the tip of the iceberg, because it has to do with the flow of capital, which is global. It doesn't need to be always local or something like that. Second, the problem of access to special arrangements like schools, hospitals, etc. Some people have unequal access to these kind of things. And these are the basic things, not only the bread and butter of the people, but also these are, a lot of people cannot afford to go to the hospital anymore. And we see that some neighborhoods are affluent, some neighborhoods are not affluent. And if we could have people have almost similar access to these arrangements, it will be interesting. But I do think that it's a deep problem. It's a bigger problem. It has to do with the flow of capital in general and how it is used to uproot some communities.
I don't want to repeat. I totally agree that it definitely exposes a lot of issues that people are struggling with, and I think in particular, one of the things that comes to mind was, and just because we're here at the Hope Forum, is 70% of those, West Side numbers stick in my mind, but 70% of those in the West Side were unbanked. And so one of the things that we thought we would do is we helped with the credit union to establish a credit union in the West Side so people would have access to, because it's so important that you have credit, right? We learned this here, and so those are the type of things that really started to come up we didn't realize. So I think it does expose a lot of issues that we begin to then address.
I think for me, first and foremost, the definition of a strong economy is broken. We use 20th century and 19th century tools to measure the strength of an economy, whether that's gross domestic product. We look at a variety of different things. We look at it as supply and demand, and so long as we're making the goods at the rate we need to make it, it's all good. Everything else is an externality. And unfortunately, we can no longer pass off people's health, people's education, people's quality of life as just an externality of what just the market does. The role of governments has always been to regulate markets, to make sure our morality is at the core of our work. What we believe does not get regulated by the market. The market is not supposed to regulate our morality. Our morality is supposed to regulate the market. And what we've done is we've let supply and demand determine who gets to get what. Who is justice for? What is a privilege? What is a right? Am I allowed to say that you're allowed to do that, or do you inherently have the right to do that? And also, the biggest problem is that it has created the fundamental definition around innovation. Because if you look a certain way and you do a certain thing, if I sell music in a really unique way, I could be innovative. Or I could be Eric Garner. It is one or the other. Because innovation is defined right now by who you are, where you live, and what zip code you grew up in. And if we want to be a smart city, we have to put metrics of equity within defining what a smart city truly is. Otherwise, we're going to leave a lot of people behind.
And I'll just close off. I think that one thing that's become apparent to us is that we are never going to reach our full potential as a city until each individual is able to reach that full potential as well. And so how do you enable that to happen? And so we're looking at our tools to determine what can we do to play a role in making that change.
Okay, thank you very much for your insightful remarks and passionate remarks. So the idea is that we turn it over to you all. I just want to emphasize one issue here, and that's this. I think there's a lot to be said for gentrification being a symptom in larger issues and bigger issues in how cities are developing. For what we're going to do, though, I think it's important to come up with ideas. It's probably important, and I don't want to influence too much what you'd all be doing, but it's probably important to try to stay focused on this issue of gentrification. And of course, there are quite a few policy options out there that immediately go to that. Housing, that is, housing. And there's lots of other issues that can be extremely important in connection to. But in order to keep the rest of the discussion more or less focused, I would suggest that you do try to bear that in mind. Thanks.
What a great wealth of knowledge these people bring to the table. So why don't we give them a quick hand? Thank you. My name is Russell Jolivet. I'm here to help facilitate this workshop. The next step we're going to do is to hear from you. We will give you about 5 minutes to ask 3 questions total and give the panel a chance to react to some of your questions. The panel came up with 4 questions that we felt were important, but we also want to hear from you. We only have about 5 minutes. We have a ton of people in the room, so that will be limited. After that, you will have a chance to break into groups and discuss each of these 4 questions and come up with your own ideas of what solutions that you would bring to the table, so that we will have a very enriched, broad perspective, more so than just from these wonderful experts up here. So we can take the first question.
Hello, Mo Cantrell from Denver, Colorado. You guys talked about empowering the neighborhoods or the communities in which gentrification is happening to them. What are a couple ideas that you guys have other than just listening to their voices?
So one of the things that we've done, actually we're graduating our first class tonight, so that's why I'll leave in about an hour, is we noticed that there were neighborhood members that had parcels of land that they had purchased or that was part of their family, and they had came to us and said, Lisa, we want to develop these, but we don't know, we don't know where to go get financing. We don't even know what we could build there. I don't even know how to deal with the building process. So we actually created a program. We've taken the first 15 through this program. It's a 6-month program, and actually we put them in front of financial advisors. We put them in front of contractors. We put them in front of builders. Anyone we could think of, and we hired someone to help teach them and take them through, so that now that their parcel of land that's been in their family, whatever they want to do with it, they have now the tools to develop it themselves and be part of the process. Again, first cohort graduating tonight.
Can you tell me what would be the next step to advocate housing as a human right?
First, have the political will. I think at the end of the day, policy is built by people who are legislating. Make sure that you put feet to the fire. We don't vote. At the end of the day, cities don't vote. 31% of this city turned out for this election. Mayor Bottoms was elected by 759 votes. 759, and Mayor Reed was elected by 714 votes. Smaller than Indian weddings combined. And that is, if we're not going to show up, don't expect that people who are making the rules have any care for what it is that you have to say. Because to you, to them, no matter how good they are, their power comes from how many people turn out to support them. And always, every single day, you are worried about that threat to your power. And in order to create a stronger and more trustworthy relationship between people and government, we have to show up. Not just at the voting booth, but you got to show up at the neighborhood meetings. You got to show up at the school board meetings. You got to show up to the Invest Atlanta meeting that is in the middle of the day, right? Like you have to sometimes. 8:30. Okay, that's the middle of the day. No, but honestly, as these entities start to make their meetings more accessible for folks, which they have, we have to now show up. As they put it online, we can't just Facebook post back and forth about it. We have to show up. And I think if we want people to make housing and affordability as a right, as people, we need to say it is a right, and we want that reflected in the people who represent us.
And just for the record, we are now
I'm giving her a hard
our
time.
meetings, so you can watch us online.
Give her a hard time. Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate your passion that all three of you speak with.
You were right with patience.
And you're almost squashing my question. But that's a good thing. What I was gonna ask, the question that I have is, and what informs my question is, I've just completed my dissertation on minimizing the effects of dislocation as in the midst of gentrification, and my research uncovered several different findings. But my question for this context is, what are some techniques that we can use to increase the amount of involvement that the community can have in the midst of gentrification? What are some things that the community can do? You've said a couple of them passionately, but there are some other things, and I thought that would be good for the group to discuss.
Yeah.
I think the very famous Charles Tilly, a political scientist, summarized that in something called the WONK: wordiness, numbers. You have to show up. You have to have You have social movement. You have to create a social movement if you want to do that, and to use those kind of tactics actually to put pressure on, what you want to achieve.
So for me, my favorite quote is, the things that are built for us without us are not for us. And at the end of the day, if we want people to show up, we also have to make it easier for them to show up. Transportation is a huge issue in our cities. I don't care if Amazon comes or not, but I care whether the city addresses transportation head on, because it is the right thing to do. Transportation must be considered a civil rights issue. In fact, it was at the core of the civil rights movement. It was a social enterprise created, and when people, it wasn't just bus riots to say, or bus protests to say, I'm not going on the buses. An alternative bus path was funded and run by the community for 381 days. 381 days to make sure that people could get there. So I would say, to your question, know that at the end of the day, we don't have to wait for government to take care of us. We're going to be all right. It doesn't matter. English Avenue looked the damn same under Obama as it does 45. And so at the end of the day, we can't wait for the savior to come. We have to take it into our own hands, and we got to do the work and invest in it. Because when you invest in it, you'll start to see the results that you actually fought for, because no one's going to do the work for you.